the Polgar Chess University. This lesson is going to be real fun. Usually I end the lesson with a jewel of the week, but in this lesson, all of the positions will be like jewels, some amazing situations. However, they will have one common theme among them, and that is that there will be an extra piece that we wish, at least for black side of the pieces, that they wouldn't have it. We have certain situations in chess when a certain piece that we have is bothering. It would be better if we wouldn't have it. It's rare, but in endgames it happens time to time. Well, let's see. Here comes our first example, which is an endgame by Ritsoya. In this position, it's white's turn. Clearly, black wants to promote the A pawn, and as we know, two connected passed pawns, once they reach the third rank from black's perspective, that is 2 files away from the promotion, are usually winning against a rook. So here, white needs to be very resourceful, not only not to lose, but actually even to win the game. I suggest you try to figure out a way how to do that, and then come back and figure out what the solution is. White can play rook d8 with the idea that if now black promotes the pawn immediately, then checkmate would arrive real quick with rook g8. But black can do better. Black can move his king to g7 to protect the bishop. And now you will see the trick that we need to deal with. If white immediately captures on f8, threatening to checkmate on g8, king captures and white can play king f6 with the idea to checkmate next. This almost looks like the solution. The problem is that now the black pawn would arrive to become a queen by giving a check, and therefore black will easily win. Let's go back. So after rook d8 and king g7, what else can white do? Well, let's try to catch the pawn for now. Rook a8, b3. As we know, black is about to advance his pawns and become a queen. The problem is if white would try the same idea of capturing the bishop and then play king f6, trying to checkmate with the 2 passed pawns, the black pawn on the a file still arrives with a check. And here comes the point, namely that white makes a waiting move. White plays h5, putting black in Zugzwang. What that means is that any move that black makes is harming their own position. If the black bishop would move right now, white would checkmate by rook g8. If the black king would move, the bishop would fall with a check followed by checkmate. But what happens if the black pawn simply advances and then trying to promote one of the 2 passed pawns? Here comes the beautiful difference that now white would be ready to capture the bishop and then play king f6, because black having that pawn on b2 covers up the diagonal, and when the pawn promotes on a1, it's no longer a check. How black would wish not to have that pawn on b2 now, because white checkmate first. What an amazing example of a piece that we would call the unwanted piece, as the b2 pawn is here in this example. Let's move on and see some more examples on this same theme. Here we go. In this position, it's white's turn. Black is about to promote their own pawn to h1. But we know that when a king is down also on the first rank and the white king is real close, there may be some checkmate dangers. Typically, white would play king g3, and if the pawn promotes now to a queen, white checkmates with rook a1. The problem here is that black can also promote the pawn to a knight, and that means it's a check. Therefore, white doesn't have the time to checkmate on a1. And after king f3, black has additional pawns, so the game is not winning, unlike if black would not have those two extra pawns, which is the normal thing that the extra pieces help, in this case, in rescuing the knight. So knowing that that position would be a draw, the question is how to yet win this game for white. Amazingly, white can and should play king h3, attacking the black pawn. Now if the pawn promotes to a knight, white would simply give a check and then capture the knight in the corner. But the real question seems to be, what happens if the pawn promotes to a queen? Remember, it's a check. Amazingly here, white can just play king g3, and because black has this unwanted pawn on g7, queen h8 doesn't do anything as of stopping the checkmate threat, which it normally would if black would not have that pawn on g7. And we're ready to move on to the next example. This is a simple looking pawn endgame with equal number of pawns. This pawn endgame looks pretty simple, but actually there is quite a bit of tricks to it. Each side has a passed pawn, but the other side's king is relatively close to it. The challenge is, how can white win? Advancing the c-pawn immediately is not a good idea because the black king would come next to it to b5 and catch it. What would happen if white would play king e5, trying to help the c-pawn? h5, c5. And now black would not advance the h-pawn because then, even though the two pawns kind of promote right one after another, at the end of the day, white would be ready to checkmate. It's very important to not stop our calculation when the pawns promote, but look at least one or two moves further. Is there a way to immediately win a queen or checkmate? In this case, there is, by playing queen c4 and then queen b3 checkmate. Pretty nice. Again, let's go back. King e5, h5, c5. The problem here is that black can play better by playing king b5. And now, after king d6, when the two pawns get promoted, white cannot force on black quite the same trick, even though white can set up a trap after the pawns get promoted by playing queen c5. So if now the black king goes to a4, then indeed white can use the same checkmate trap with queen c4. But after king a6, on the other hand, white has nothing. White cannot make real progress because either white just keeps giving checks himself, or if white tries to help creating a checkmate threat with a quiet move, then it will be black's turn to give pretty much eternal checks or force the exchange of the queens, which would result in a drawn pawn endgame. With that in mind, let's get back to our starting position and see how can white still win. White can win here using the same typical theme of the two isolated pawns with one file in between them protecting each other. Of course, there is a bit more to it in this case. If the black king simply captures the pawn, the white pawn runs away. But what happens if black instead plays h5? with the idea that after king g5, h4, purposefully giving that pawn up, you'll see very soon why, and then only capture the pawn and result a queen versus pawn endgame, but with having a rook pawn on the second rank and with the white king being as far as it is, this is an easy draw, as we already studied in a previous lesson. Getting back again, a3 is the correct first move, but after h5, white needs to be very tricky. White needs to do the following. Play king g3, h4. Black, as you see, is trying desperately to get rid of his h-pawn, but white is in no need to capture it. In fact, white shouldn't capture it, and it's much better to play king h3. You'll discover soon the reason why. King takes, white pushes the pawn and promotes it real soon, and we reach that same type of endgame that I mentioned a minute ago. When white captured the pawn on h5 was a draw. Here black has, and again, an unwanted pawn, the pawn on h4. But how does this make a difference? This is how. After check, king a1, it's true that the black king is in a stalemate position, and in this case the simplest solution is not to bring the king, but to simply get the queen to c2. Let me show you that method. Simply zigzag up, check, and after queen b3, king a1, move the king out of the way. When the pawn advances, queen c2, and just on time the queen arrives with a checkmate. Quite a nice example of an unwanted pawn. So when one side, the side with the pawn versus the queen, has an extra pawn, that's usually a minus, not a plus, because it avoids these stalemate ideas. Let's move on to our next example, where we'll deal with some similar ideas. As usual, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out what is the correct solution. Then come back and listen to the answer. Generally, the most natural moves are when we capture a pawn. It doesn't mean that they always are the best choices, though. In this case, let's say pawn takes on g6 would be a mistake and would give away the win. Because after a3, if the pawns keep advancing, white will have a queen and knight versus queen, but that's not a sufficient material advantage. If instead white would try to catch the pawn, the game would still be a draw because of a similar queen versus pawn endgame as we discussed in the previous position, and there is no win here for white. After pawn takes, a3, knight d4, a2, if white instead plays the tricky g7, with the idea that if now pawn promotes, then knight b3 fork, king c3, and the game can still be saved miraculously. Pawn promotes, the black pawn promotes as well. Normally, game over, queen knight versus queen is a draw, but here there is almost a win with queen c8 check. Look at that. If now the king moves to b2, white checkmates in 2 with queen c2 and queen b3. Or if after queen c8 check, the king moves to b4, knight c2 forks. Or after king takes knight, the skewer arrives in the corner with queen h8. So seems like we covered almost all the moves that the black king has. But luckily for black, the king has just one good square, which is sufficient, going to d3, and then there's nothing that white can do to win the game. Unless, of course, black makes a future mistake. Let's go back again to the starting position and examine what would happen if the king would capture the pawn. Then again, black would hurry up and advance the pawn, and after knight c3, king takes, even though the white pawn seems to promote first, because if now pawn promotes, white promotes and wins the queen, so black needs to play king b2, allowing pawn promotion, but not the win of the game, because as we know, a queen versus a rook pawn already on the second rank typically is a draw, when the white king is far away as it is here. Learning from the previous examples, hopefully you got an idea what may be the winning plan. We actually want to keep this g6 pawn on the board by playing h6. a3, we're using the same idea, playing knight c3, holding off the a2 square for now so the pawn cannot advance, and if the king captures, then we're not capturing the pawn but moving the king to g8. a2, h7, and now black is stuck with an unwanted pawn on g6. The method we're using is the same. We're giving a number of checks, and with the method of zigzag, moving the queen up towards the c2 square, and then luckily black is not in stalemate because they have that extra pawn on g6, and here we are ready to checkmate. Quite amazing. And now let's see the next example. Here we go with another pawn endgame. As usual, each side needs to advance the passed pawns. In this example again, just like in the previous one, it's important to keep an additional black pawn on the board. And white passes by, does not capture the pawn in order to achieve the win. Similarly, in endgames queen versus bishop pawn, black gets excellent drawing chances if that pawn wouldn't be on the board. Here, on the other hand, black cannot escape with the typical method of stalemate when the black king would move onto the corner. Let me just zigzag up with the queen quickly to show you. King h2, queen f5, king g4, queen h2, queen f3, king g1, queen g3. And here we go when typically black would save the game by playing king h1, and if queen takes pawn, draw. Wouldn't be the case here because black has an extra unwanted pawn on a5. And finally, let's see our last example in this lesson on the theme of unwanted pieces or unwanted pawns. Here we are. It seems pretty sad for white when the black pawn is about to get promoted, and there's no way we can stop that. If the white pawn advances immediately to f6, black would promote the pawn to a queen, then capture the bishop, and even though white has a bishop pawn, because they have in addition an extra pawn, the game is not a draw, black is winning. Yet white, finding the correct solution, can still tie the game. And the method is desperately giving up all the other pieces but the f-pawn. The bishop for now is catching the pawn, so black has no choice but capture, and now we're reaching a theoretically drawn endgame. Black can make a tricky move by playing queen e1, not allowing the king coming next to the pawn, and also if pawn promotes, then skewer comes from queen b4. But nevertheless, after king d7, queen b4, king e8, the game is still a draw. I hope you learned some ideas, and remember, capturing your opponent's pieces is usually the right thing to do, but not always. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.